Okay. So I've been.
So that's Loch Ness there.
Oh, lovely.
So it's getting dark. But yeah.
Scotland.
Yeah, it's starting to get dark already. It's 4 o'clock.
Well, look, I wanted to talk to you for quite a while, actually. And just looking at the pictures on the internet, on your site, on your model site, the photos, looking at the situation and something I've been interested in for a long time, which is what happens when somebody has an experience, sees something that they can't unsee and makes a huge life decision based upon that and dedicates everything they've got, everything they are to this new venture, which is something you did in 1991, which to me is astounding. It's kind of the dream, but as a pragmatic man, a realist, I realize that no dream is really a dream in its reality. So just take us into that, just really briefly. How did you come about making this big decision? I'm going to go and find a Loch Ness monster. I'm going to go and live next to the loch in this van, sell all my possessions, and that's going to be my life.
I suppose because I was 28, that was the first thing that made it possible. If I was any older, I'd have probably bought a house. Well, I had bought a house. I would have already been settled down, married with kids, and then the option would have gone. But it certainly wasn't based on the back of having already had a sighting. It was based on coming here as a 7-year-old boy, falling in love with the whole potential. When the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau was here, I saw what they were doing and just fell in love with the mystery, like many people do. 7-year-old boy, suit of monsters. That's me. When I grow up, I want to be one of them. And I think I would have been content to remain in the rat race and come up here in my spare time, like many other people successfully happily do, and retain this as a hobby. But after 10 years of working in different creative jobs where I was quite happy with the work-life balance when I was doing creative stuff and then coming up here in my spare time, I went into a partnership installing security alarms in the mid-1980s. Hated it. Hated the whole feeling of the work. There's no creativity. You almost feel like an undertaker in somebody's house because nobody wants to spend £500 on a burglar alarm, but they feel they do because of security. And it was then age 28, and I'm thinking, well, I've got a long-term girlfriend. We've bought a house. I suppose marriage is coming up, and then kids. God, having kids. And I thought, do I want all that? What other things are shouting at me that I want to do? And this was it. This was always there going, because I was always coming up in my spare time with a tent and sitting on the side of the lot. Mostly I'd go to the old pier at Inverfarragig and I'd sit there maybe for 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, and be elated with the passion, the occupation of just staring at Loch Ness in the hope of spotting something. And I thought, no, I'm not going to get to the ripe old age of deathbed and look back and say, I could have done that when I was 28. I had a tipping point of going the predictable or the unpredictable. What am I going to do? And for the fear of the unknown, I think a lot of people would go, mortgage, wife and kids, I better stay with the security.
Yeah.
Literally for me, the security business. And I thought, no, I don't know. I have no idea what becomes of somebody dedicating their life full time to the pursuit of this mystery. The only example I could ever think of was Frank Searle, and he wasn't a particularly good example. And so I thought, I'm going to do it. And when I initially made the decision to do it, I didn't even know how I was going to do it. I didn't know that I was going to live in this van for the next 30 years.
Wow.
I thought, right, I'm going to have to pick up the relationship and sell the house. There'll be a little bit of money left over from the sale of the house, which will divide up between us. And I ended up, from having a house for 3 years, back then in the mid-1980s, I walked away with £10,000. That was my share of the profit of it.
Wow.
So that was my budget for forever onwards.
Wow.
So, pushing me for the first few years, I could I didn't know how I was going to fund what I was going to do here, and I didn't know I'd live in the van. I didn't know that. I thought, well, will I buy a boat and float about on a boat? I got onto the estate agents in Inverness from Dorset, where I'm from. They got a phone call from a bloke in Dorset saying, "Can you send me any house for sale on the side of Loch Ness?" And they only ever sent me one house. But it was no, I wasn't. That didn't seem to be the right way I want to do this. And then this van turned up. My brother found this van through a mate of his, and we went down and looked at it. And it was in the corner of a farmyard. And the lad that owned it, he lived in Puddletown, and he'd taken this van down to Spain and lived in it for a couple of years down there. Then he'd come back and he'd got a winter let cottage in Puddletown. And this van was his only form of transport, and he didn't have any employment. And then the winter let got extended on the cottage he was living in, and well, I need to stay in the cottage, but going to the job centre in that blooming truck, I need to sell the truck. And so I turned up in the farmyard, looked at it, and I actually on the day I saw the van, I took about 5 photographs of it. Nipped off down to Boots and got them developed in the 24-hour developing thing. Got my photographs back. And sat there for the next weekend just looking at these 5 photographs thinking, is this what I'm going to, will this work? Will this work? Really?
That sounds I thought, harrowing.
Yeah, and the van cost me $1.5 grand. So
wow,
that's the first bite out of the budget. And then the video camera that I needed to buy, because I needed some equipment to film whatever I spot, that cost me another $1.5 grand. So there's $3 grand gone. So that was it. And no knowledge when I set off as to, is this hunt going to last a year? Am I going to retreat south as soon as the snow comes along? I didn't know what was going to happen.
But I think we often in life find ourselves in those crossroad positions, don't we? Those make or break positions. Where you go one way, even with a day's notice either side, and your whole future changes.
Absolutely. And people often talk to me about their life-changing moments. Some with regret that they didn't risk of the unpredictability, and some with joy that they did take the risk of that. And there's been a few that have come here and said, it's been a few decades that I've been trying to get here to see you, just to say thank you, because what you did, and when I made this video diary thing in the first year, when they saw that tipped a few people off of the rat race, off the treadmill, and made them think, I can't go back in the office on Monday and carry on as I've been doing in the job that I hate. I am going to go and so people do often reach these crossroads, and you have these great ideas. This is the adventure I want to live. I'm going to do this. I'm going to buy a boat and I'm going to sail around the world, blue water cruising. And then you wake up the next day and you think, oh, actually, that might not be the best.
I get seasick. That kind of thing.
Yeah. And so people, when faced with the predictable and the unpredictable, mostly go for the predictable.
Because human nature is to caution. I guess you probably find that there in your first harsh Scottish winter. And being from down south, I'm from South Wales, and it's rainy there, but it's not particularly cold. And the first time I went to Inverness, it was in the winter, and I thought, oh my goodness, what is this? What it's like for like 4 hours a day.
Well, this van used to be a mobile library in its initial life, and like the concertina doors on a mobile library that sort of open like that. It sort of does that. Well, there's a doorstep just over there, and the doorstep, because it was a rectangle that stuck out, the door as it opened had this letterbox slit cut in it, so that the door would open and go over and below and below the doorstep. So you got a letterbox size slit down there. For the first winter, I didn't think, hang on, if I just cut a U-shaped bit out of that step, I can panel off that bit. So I've got a curtain that I hang on that door every night. And the wind and rain used to come in that slit, and the curtain would get the curtain would get wetter and wetter up it. And in the first winter, I remember waking up in the morning and to open the door to go out, lifting the curtain off in a wanna, like a sheet of corrugated iron. The whole curtain frozen on the inside, lifting that and standing it there, and then thinking, I need to do something about the weather coming in that little slit down there. Yeah, you learn pretty quickly.
Look, we're both openers, and I know there's different nations, but it's essentially one island, one country, but they're different lands, and topographically and environmentally, and I think that that was a big eye opener to me. And talking about you've been there this whole time. There was a sighting. Now I was surprised to know it wasn't the sighting that brought you there. You were essentially a Nessie Hunter and waiting from a 7-year-old boy upwards.
Yeah.
But when did you have your sighting, and what did you see?
In the first year, and I couldn't believe it. The van was still mobile then, so I had like 12 different vantage points around Loch Ness. I'd move on a whim from one end of the loch to the other or wherever. It was all around Loch Ness. It was a very rare treat that decade. But in the first year, I was parked where the canal comes out at Fort Augustus. If you come out of the canal, on the left side, there's a little turning circle there.
Yeah, I know it.
It's no tarmacked. It used to be just gravel and puddles.
Yeah.
And I used to park there and sit on the end of that canal. I'd sit there for a week in the van, watching that end of the water. Then getting to know the boys that have got the boat at Fort Augustus.
Yeah.
About 11 o'clock in the morning, myself and a friend were stood looking across the mouth of the canal, so into the water behind the abbey.
Yeah.
And the waves were coming out from the abbey, and the waves must have been 1.5 foot, 2 foot high. So that they're all going that way. And this thing just shot through like a torpedo, just a splash of water off of each wave hit it. And it must have been it was quite a way across the bay, but not too far across the bay. But you couldn't see what it was. You could only see something going through really fast against the waves and the spray coming off of it. And that was much less than 10 seconds that I stood there frozen, just thinking, what is that? And then it was gone. And
real speed. I mean, a real fast movement as well.
And there isn't anything we know about in here that could cause that.
Yeah.
The biggest thing we ever get in here would be a seal, and a seal does not shoot through the water putting up a spray of water. It's not one of the characteristics.
They don't swim that way.
They don't swim that way.
Yeah.
So whatever it was, that was the first heart racing moment. And that was when I realized I had to get a bit quicker at taking photographs of these things when they pop up. And
and that's somewhere that the average sighting's around about 8 seconds.
Yeah. I think whatever these animals are, they only break the surface by accident.
Yeah.
Don't think it's something that they do as a matter of course. The most common time for a sighting is on a day when the water's flat calm. Firstly, because it's the easiest time to spot a disturbance.
Yeah.
But also, if you imagine in the first 2 or 3 meters, that's where a lot of the fish live there. So if you've got the roof of the world on a calm day is silent, you've got these bigger predators that are swimming around feeding on fish. If they are chasing the fish and they get just too high in their world, their back breaks the surface. We get a brief sighting of something. It becomes aware that it's too high up in its whole environment, and back down it goes. I think that's the main reason we get sightings.
That makes perfect sense to me. What do you think about the theory about lots of the sightings being near river mouth villages? I often thought for a while with the salmon and trout runs, it would be a good place to catch the fish as they come into deeper water.
Absolutely. Yeah. River mouths. The boys that work along here a mile outside of Dawes is the fish farm.
Oh, yeah.
They've had sightings off of there. There's a big catchment of something that is fish, which is obviously the food source. Yeah. It makes perfect sense because, out in a lot of the areas of the loch, there's not that much fish activity at the surface. But, not that much in the whole loch. But at the river mouths, there's more. So yeah.
What do you think then of the? I mean, you've been asked these questions a million times, I'm sure, but this theory that skeptics keep putting forward, there's not enough food in the loch for an animal. But I think, well, there are fish farms, there's a fishing industry. Surely there's enough food for us, and they eat fish. There must be enough food for them.
Yeah, it's in actual fact, there's only probably been 2, maybe 3, apart from your recent New Zealand professor's DNA study.
Yeah.
Apart from that, there's only been 2 or 3 big surveys of the fish population.
Yeah.
And they come up with wildly differing numbers of food stock in here. Yeah. Now, Adrian Shine, people have certainly done a very good amount of research into estimating the fish population. And I get on very well with Adrian, and I talk to him about his fish counts.
Yeah.
And yeah, you just said about the fish at the mouths of a river.
Yeah.
Well, if you go in with a boat around the mouth of a river using sonar, you will get contacts with lots of those fish. But because the river's coming in and it's aerating the water, you will also get a lot of contacts with air bubbles. So I remember once 20 years ago, talking to Adrian and him saying, yes, well, the contacts, the things that you think are fish that Nessie's feeding on at the mouths of rivers, that's not fish at all. That's gas and oxygen in the water.
Okay.
And I thought to myself, well, tell that to the local guys that stand there with a fly fishing rod pulling the salmon out from those exact locations. They're not all air bubbles. There are fish in abundance, not in abundance, but so there's so little amount of research done into the overall population of fish that I take that with a pinch of salt, really.
That was my point. I thought it would be very, very hard to evaluate that, and the assumption of scientific research, normally, like Professor Gembel's research, it's proportional as statistical models based upon sampling, and then you spread the model out to the entirety of the loch. Yeah, and you're never really going to get a true picture. And it's the same with all statistics, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
You can skew them whichever way you want. And talking about Professor Gembel's research, that was a big blow for a lot of people in the Nessie community. But I remember still feeling at the time, well, based upon that sampling range and the depths and the locations and the lack of, I think, otters coming up in this particular research.
Seals weren't detected. Things that we know are present here, he didn't. And, I went round to the press conference for the launch for him to unleash all his findings.
Yeah.
I really didn't know what to expect, and I thought this could be the death of everything. He could say there's nothing in here whatsoever, but he didn't, and he sort of decided to err on the side of accentuating the eel side of the thing he found the most of. But that is no news story that there's eels in Loch Ness. We know that. Everybody knows that. And that was that. And I sat there thinking, well, eels, that doesn't explain everything. And then it came to the question and answers bit. Yeah. And I was the only civilian there. The rest were all media from all over the world. And I asked a few questions about seals and otters that we found there. We haven't found. And the very last question was asked by a reporter, I think he was French, just along from me. And he said, and was there any DNA that you could not identify that and Professor Gembel muttered his answer. He said, well, yeah, it's actually about 20%. And now he said 20%, but the following Sunday, a much more thought out, his hour-long documentary about his findings came out. That wasn't a snap answer to the question, because he actually addressed the same question in his documentary.
Yeah.
And he said 25% was unidentified. Now, obviously, that is the takeaway bit of news. 1 in 4 of the DNA samples in Loch Ness cannot be identified. That leaves enough room for Nessie to be in that quarter of all results. Yeah. But if you think about it, Professor Gembel can't stand up in front of the world's press and say 25% of what I've just done I can't explain, because his discipline doesn't look quite as groundbreaking as he wants it to look, and the future funding, which he
And
has
that's the
achieved.
point. Exactly.
So that's the elephant in the room to him. That's Nessie in the room to him. But to me, that's where.
Isn't it funny though how people don't think about that in the scientific side? I mean, when we're talking about evidence for as yet undiscovered, or maybe living fossils or whatever the animal might be, living on in parts of the world, it's very stringent. What we can present and what we can offer is very stringent. When you come to a scientific principle like that, say we had to omit 25% of our findings because we couldn't verify them, nobody even blinks. Say, oh, we're fine, 25%, we'll give you that. And it's kind of it's an odd double standard, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and there is his argument is, well, and in fact he said at the press conference, if we did a eDNA sample in an underground station in New York, 20% of the results we wouldn't be able to identify.
Okay.
It's just that some samples are,
they're not complete, they're not verifiable.
Yeah. So he's got his get out of why a quarter of things, but it still leaves room for it not being which was a massive relief. And
definitely. When you spent so long as well, and you must have spoken to so many witnesses during your lifetime. And I think I just had an accident there. And I think when you talk to those people and you get that genuine response from them, and you've believed somebody, the person that's spoken to you has seen what they say they've seen. It must be very difficult to justify when somebody comes along and says, "Well, actually, no."
I remember Ian Cameron, the old ex-chief inspector policeman. He was in a lot of the documentaries back in the 90s.
I remember him.
I would sit with him then when we were both being interviewed at the same sort of time or whatever, and I'd often be in his company. And he would say, "I don't care what it eats. It could eat thin air for all you like. I've seen it." And that is the kind of feeling I get from so many witnesses that I talk to. I don't care what the professors say. I don't care who other people say this isn't possible. It is possible because I've seen it. And very hard to prove that wrong, and often those same people if they've got a really exciting description of what they've seen, I'll say, "Do you mind if I just write this down, or maybe get somebody from the media or somebody to talk to you, or get this on record? Can I just film you talking about it even so that we've got it on record?" "Oh, no, I've seen what's happened to so many others."
Do you think they're less likely to go on record if they're local than if they're a tourist visiting from another place? Because you've got to live it there, haven't you? Then you've got to be Andy who saw the Bigfoot, or Steve who saw the Nessie, and go back into the office the next morning and face everybody.
It's not. I don't think it's even so much that. I think if you live here, you could live here for 30 years and not see anything, but in that 30 years, you will have seen other local residents that have seen something and have gone into the public domain and have had the Mickey ripped out of them and have gone to the pub and said, "I don't know why I bothered telling them," because it turned into a bit of an embarrassment. And so that's the motivation for people not talking that live locally. But if you're up here on holiday, you're not so aware of the back catalogue of people that the mick taken out of them for saying they've seen Nessie.
You don't know what you've got coming, basically.
So many of them say, "I'll tell you because you're obviously passionate about it." And
do many let you report with that, anonymously? I always offer all my witnesses anonymous report. In fact, in the book, I tell them you'll be an anonymous witness unless you say otherwise. That's the way we do it, to make sure that you'll give me the story.
Yeah, I don't. I think my not my motivation, but my inclination has changed over nearly 30 years of being here. I think initially I was absolutely militant about trying to make things public, to convince the outside world that you've got this world-class mystery here to be explained. And as time's gone on, and I've listened to the skeptics around the world, and very often the people that know the least about it saying the most negative things about it. And now when I talk to somebody and they tell me what they've seen and they don't want to talk publicly, I pretty much concur with them and say, well, I'm actually doing this to satisfy my curiosity and the curiosity of me when I was 7, and that has remained forever with me. And if the outside world doesn't get to hear about this particular sighting, that's secondary to me. That's not the priority. The priority is that I get to hear about this stuff and form some sort of understanding of what's going on here.
And as far as the papers are concerned, there'll be more witnesses. I'll give them stories in time to come. There's no shortage of it over time. So to omit one doesn't really hurt.
The nonsense that gets into the press now is unbelievable. I
remember the recent recent catfish Photoshop. There was the back of clearly a Photoshop back of a catfish. Placed inside the Loch Neo Quad castle.
Everybody said that is just Photoshop, but
it
still
posted so many times. I was shocked.
Yeah, and that should have been binned at the start and just walk away from it. Just tell the bloke to get another hobby other than messing about on Photoshop.
I think he'd actually come out saying he faked it before he made the papers.
No, I didn't realise the connection until very late on in the story, but about a month, no, not even a month, maybe 2 weeks before his pictures came out onto the internet, somebody sent me another picture, a different Photoshop splash in water. And I looked at that and I just sent him an email back saying, yeah, that's the worst example of Photoshop I've seen. Get yourself another hobby, mate. Exactly. And that was the end of it. But then he obviously had another go at Photoshop and came up with that one, which
he went again,
and then fired that into one of these websites. And the generating of interest, wasn't until it had been in public domain for a month or two and been debated, and everybody was saying it's Photoshop.
Yeah.
And then I thought, hang on, let me just see. And I went back through my emails and I thought, oh, it's the same person.
Okay. This is what I remember. This is where the unraveling came from. You published that first photo.
Yeah. On the same day as somebody else did the brilliant bit of research of actually going back through photographs of catfish and finding the hump that the guy had done a Frank Searles up and cut the hump out and stuck it onto the picture of the water. Yeah. So those two,
I think, it generates interest, and I think from the newspaper's point of view, I don't feel badly towards them. Essentially, I kind of consider that general life is sort of a little bit mundane and it doesn't have the same draw to it as the flash that they put on in the newspapers, and they've got to dress it up and throw something out. It's always going to be that way, but it's a shame in a sense because there's so many good pieces of evidence out there that they could use. Now, talking about that, let's talk about the sonar contacts. We've got 2 now, is that right?
Yeah. Well, number 2 has gone public.
Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I certainly do think it, and I've called it from the start game-changing because in 30 years of sitting here, this is the first single piece of evidence that I can hold. When somebody says, there's nothing in Loch Ness, I can hold up a copy of that and say, there is a big, solid object exactly looking to this description that is what sonar can tell you of what we're looking for. There is one better than sketchy photographs or so much of the
rest.
We're just talking about the rubbish that is constantly going into the media. Suddenly there's a quality piece of evidence, and it's been so long in the coming that to me, knowing so long, it couldn't come from a source that I trust more. I have every faith in Ronald. He, some people would say, oh, well, he drives a tourist boat. He's doing it for publicity. It's October. The tourists have gone. And
we're also in a COVID shutdown.
yeah, and believe me, because he does occasionally email me, WhatsApp me a photograph of, say, oh, look, I've just got this one. Interesting. Yeah. He sent me that one. And I was in Tesco's, actually. And I stopped and I looked at it. And it's like, because it's actually hang on, I've got it here. The image, that right, is such a, if you cut it off there and there, surface of the lock, side of the lock, bottom, and this thing, that is such an iconic image. It couldn't be more central, it couldn't be more pronounced. And as soon as I looked at that, I thought, the world needs to see this. The world needs to see that we're not just mistakenly looking at twigs and sticks and swimming dogs. There is actually, bang, this a machine, a sonar machine, with such a thing as that, doesn't make mistakes. It doesn't say, oh, well, it's not sketchy. There has to be something there of that proportion for it to show up on the screen.
Well, it looks completely clear and completely different to the surrounding topography. Now, there was a second one just recently. Is that just yesterday or a few days ago?
Because Ronald is, believe it or not, a very shy individual. He's dealt with media all the time because he lives at Fort Augustus and he drives a pleasure boat. He's been involved with all sorts of stuff like that, and he's never courted it. He's never wanted to put himself in the front of the camera, going online as anything. So he's totally shied away from it. But with that, I got onto him so much, saying, look, we owe it to the mystery to show the world that we're not just fooled by nonsense. And eventually he agreed to put the first one out there. And then he sent me a few days later, he sent me the second image. And I said, what do you want to do with this? Oh, I'm not putting it out there. I don't want to appear hungry for it. I don't want to. I could read messages that he doesn't want.
It's confirmation.
Well, and it was only me keeping on to him again and said, look, this, yes, as you say, this confirms the first thing that, and I've been talking to him yesterday and all the time, and he's been saying that because that is the tip of the iceberg. There are other contacts coming from those boats down there, and there always has been. The sonar equipment has got better and better and better over the years. And the guys that work on those boats see contacts on there. They don't get overexcited. They will get their mobile phone out and they'll take a photograph of the screen because they've got the big screens in the saloon. They'll take a picture of that and they'll build up their own record of interesting things. And then when I go to Fort Augustus, I go, oh, look at this one we got last week, or look at this one. What the hell's that? But they don't go into the public domain. It's not, if you go out on the boat, they may get their phone out and show the passenger on the boat.
Yeah, and usually I would guess that they're not looking at something so certain, so definite. There's some dispute about the other images they're showing you, and this one is clearly very different. It's very...
it's big. It's not the biggest one I've seen recently.
20 feet, did you say? Around 20 feet? They're having it verified, is that right?
It's really, really impossible, really, to tell the length of an object with sonar. It doesn't give you that information. If the beam is constantly pinging like that in the one point, as you travel along, the loch pan is like a unraveling. Remember those old music sheets that used to have, that goes, and the thing that the needle
could it almost drag the signal along.
Yeah, it's drawing a constant map of what's below it, and that thing plays out. So the width that you see is not the width of the object; it's the time that it's remained in the beam. That's what gives if it's just a little fish, it will just be a dot because it's only been in the beam for a very short period of time. Well, that thing was in the beam for about 10 seconds.
So that's where you get the estimate of length from, is the time it stays in the beam.
Yeah.
Get it? Yeah. Well, it's fascinating anyway, just to see that. And similarly to yourself. I think when you arrived at Loch in 1990, when I was 15. So, but similarly to yourself, I was into this from day dot. It seemed that way anyway. I'm not sure if it was the In Search of or Arthur C. Clarke's programs that kind of got me looking at these things. Who knows? It must have been in the background on television my whole youth. And visiting it for the first time, the thing that really struck me about the water was that the way it moved and the bow waves, how long they remained after the boats travelled through this narrow, it's only about a mile and a half wide at points, isn't it? This narrow stretch of deep water, was just how hard it would be when the water isn't flat to spot anything convincingly. If something just popped up slightly, it would be really difficult to get a gauge of that. And I remember looking at the water for hours and hours and hours the first time and just thinking, did I see something in? Did I see something there? No, this is just a body of water with very strange surface activity on it. So do you tire of looking at photos people have sent you of waves and of sticks sticking out of the loch and bits of log and reviewing them, or do you have just the same patience as you always seem to demonstrate with these things and instructing the person as to what they're looking at?
Well, I would say with the false alarms that you see when you're looking at the water, that the first decade is the hardest. But I've noticed sort of maybe with the advent of the internet, because when I started this, the internet didn't exist, and so there wasn't as many false alarms that the public domain. But certainly in the last decade or so, there's been lots and lots of false alarms, and I've noticed that part of my occupation has become, my heart does sink every time I see a new picture and it's patently a false alarm. And I actually find that I do actually now enjoy the investigation of, well, what is that then? That's the
debunking.
Well, the debunking it's not really the right word. It's the explaining. If it's not Nessie, then what is the mundane explanation? Hopefully, it is. The next picture is going to be Nessie. But if there's a mundane explanation for this, let's try and work out what it is. Remember the anonymous American guy that took a picture from the Klansman of looking out across the water of this lovely great big shape. It almost looked like it was stuck on top of the water. Huge great big thing with a little bit of a neck sticking out on it. Anonymous. He said he was driving along in his car. His girlfriend spotted something. He wound the window down and photographed it from a lay-by by the Klansman. As soon as I saw it, I thought, that is nonsense. And I spent ages around there taking, if you looked out of your window now and took a photograph, and then walked 100 yards down the road and took the same photograph in the same direction, you would be able to tell which picture was taken where due to the way things line up. And with that American photograph, I could go to the place he said he'd taken it. It did not line up. It was impossible for it to line up. There's a massive amount of
I remember this one now. But
you could trigonometry line it up with the other hillside and the trees up there, cottages. And you could find, and it all lined up back to this window on this holiday let cottage up on the hill.
To smudge on the window.
Yeah. And so I've got my tablet, and I'm stood outside this holiday cottage, lining it up, looking at this view, thinking, it's right outside this window. And this bloke tapped on the window, and I went, oh yeah, sorry. So I went round to the door and introduced myself. I said, I'm just in your garden because I've got this photograph and I'm trying to work out where he took it from. And he was like, all right, do you want to come in and have a look through the window from the inside? I was like, do you mind if I do? So I went in and sure enough lined it up. And then I said to him, do you mind if I go and get a bit of mud? He's like, no, that's all right. Go on then. And I got a bit of mud and I smudged it on the window there. And him and his wife are stood there going, oh, this is great. This has made our holiday because we haven't seen nothing looking out of that window all the time we've been here. But You think that's what he's done? And sure enough, you could do it, and it all explained
Yeah.
exactly the chain of events of what this anonymous American had actually done. There was nowhere else he could have been but that window. So there is a feeling of satisfaction when,
Yeah.
beyond doubt, proving a false. And I find there's mostly false alarms that we get here are accidental false alarms.
Yeah.
You'll hear a lot of times people saying, "Well, I didn't see it at the time, but when I got home and looked at my holiday photographs, there it was in the background."
Yeah. Classic.
And yeah, classic. And sometimes there's a bird flying past,
Yeah.
or sometimes there was one that actually made the newspapers years ago. And I looked at it, this honeymooning couple stood over in the lay-by where the Wellington bomber was brought up. They stood there, and there was this two-humped silhouette way off in the middle of the loch, way off up here somewhere. And as soon as I saw the silhouette, I thought, that is the Fingal barge. It's a Dutch barge that is about 120 foot long. But in silhouette, it just had these two, the cabin at the front and the back and the bow. It's just, and you wouldn't know that unless. So anyway, that to them that was an accidental false alarm site, because they weren't setting out to fool.
They didn't know what they'd seen from that distance.
And there's not that many that set out deliberately to fool. There was one last year. There was a guy. He was on one of the pleasure boats that come out of Urquhart Bay and go to the castle and back. Those boats. And the story that he put out, along with his photograph of this gnarly head in the water, was that the boat was nearing Urquhart Castle. Everyone was on that side of the boat looking at the castle and taking photographs. He, meanwhile, was on this side, and this head came up in the water. He quickly took his one photograph, then called everybody else over from, "Look, Nessie's here." And by the time they got over there, it was gone. And here's this gnarly head in the water. And I looked at it and I thought, nah, that doesn't. Well, if I open these curtains now, there's a line of boulders that go down the beach to the. And I took the photograph down to the water's edge and looked at the furthest boulder that stands out in the water. There it is. Exactly the same bloody thing. All he's done is come along Dawes Beach, he's photographed that rock, and then gone, "Oh, I'll have a laugh. I'll tell him I took the water." So if you didn't know where that rock was, and you wouldn't be able to solve that image. But
that's the great thing about having this local expertise, is because I think it's the same. Again, I work in healthcare. Doctors say the same all the time. When somebody walks through the door, they say, "Flu, that's a cold, that's a chest infection." They don't even have to sit down. You feel it, you know it as soon as you look at it. You got the muscle memory to know what's happening as soon as you look at it. So you might remember, I was in Loch Ness last time, 2019 in January, looking at what turned out to be a piece of gantry on the old bridge and the River Oich. I don't know what the bridge is called.
Yeah.
The local military historian who goes on the tours.
His name Phillips, wasn't it?
I wish I could remember his name, but maybe I shouldn't say it actually. But he'd had a way up down. I had a look around, and eventually it came out. Clearly, it looked like a head and neck. It was a whole story about hearing a puff of water and a gasp, and only getting the picture on his Instagram account because his phone was low on space. And I just thought, well, everything deserves investigation. I'm coming up anyway. Let's go and have a look. But the thing that was most valid to me about the trip, actually, segue from that, is that just seeing, because I was in Fort Augustus and I was walking the River Oich up to Loch. What's the loch in between Loch Oich and I forget it anyway. Yeah, so I was walking that way, walking and sort of spending time walking around the loch at night time, and thinking, this is an area that sees hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, and yet at night it's purely black. It's pristine. You really can't see a single thing. So there is a lot of, I suppose, room. I walked along the River Oich at night. I kind of got stuck walking back there at night. I thought, there's the river there. There's the canal. If there was anything there, I could not see it, even if I could hear it, even if I went to the river's edge. Is there a possibility that this animal, albeit in a sort of a roundabout way, makes his way out to the sea that way? It'd have to be, I suppose, make a few sojourns on land, or the other way through the town, through Inverness and the river in Inverness, seems even less likely because of the amount of footfall that goes along the river. Is there a way out either end? And there is sort of a way for an amphibious animal, in my opinion, but does it seem feasible to you?
To me, it doesn't. I must admit, looking at the terrain, I can't see it happening. I think there's so many people that live certainly down. It would have to go down the river. It couldn't go through the canal. Down the river. The river's very shallow in the middle of Inverness.
Yeah.
Traffic going past.
No, I mean on the other side via.
On the other side, you've still got you've got 30. It's about 35 miles to the sea that way. You know, best off on
journey. What about traversing through to Loch Hoich and Loch Lochy, Loch Garry, and sort of spending time in these different lochs at certain points? I know they're not as busy as Loch Ness, but they will still have a population and a relative footfall.
Certainly Loch Lochy, people say they've seen things in there, and I find with all these things you can never say never. And personally, I think what we're looking for in Loch Ness is resident in here. There's Adrian Shine's theory of the sturgeon being the explanation.
Yeah.
Just he puts that forward as a suggestion.
Yeah.
He doesn't say. He says that the sturgeon isn't resident in here. It's only come in here and gone back out again.
Yeah.
That is that's a big leap to me that it's done that.
It seems. I mean, they're rare enough as it is. It doesn't. I know you're friends with Roland Watson as well, and there's a few of the concepts I like in his blogs. And one of the concepts he mentioned, I don't really agree with his theory on what it might be, but one of the concepts I like is he uses this: my theory sucks the least theory with the skeptics. So you basically make it some really far out explanation, like a sturgeon making its way in and mimicking in some way the features of this beast that we've had reported all these years. Because although it's not very plausible, it beats the theory that there's some huge prehistoric creature or other unknown creature living in Loch Ness undetected. So people are more likely to believe that, aren't they? Even though it's not plausible that a sturgeon looks like a big hump beast occasionally seen with a long neck and whatever else that's been reported over the years. You had your money on catfish for a while, was that right?
Only as the best. In fact, it was Dick Rayner that put me onto that suggestion. Only as the least unlikely of all the explanations for the reasons of the longevity of how long it lives, its relative size, the back that it's got fits the description, and that it was released in a couple of lakes in England for sport, for fishing in the Victorian era.
Yeah,
it's not beyond the stretch of the imagination that could have also happened here. And that would account for what people have been seeing, and it would account for the number of sightings dropping off right about now. If that population of fish weren't breeding, then we'd be looking for the last one or two. But I realised the mistake, the error of my ways, saying to a freelance journalist that was my best guess, and then to be woken up by Sky News phoning me saying, "Where are you? We're on the way up the A9 with the satellite truck." And I said, "Well, what do you want to come to me for?" And they said, "Have you not seen the Times newspaper?" No. "Oh, well, you say that you've solved the mystery. It's a Welsh cat. And now you've solved it, you're heading off back down to Dorset where you came from." Am I? I'm not even out of bed yet. And I'm being, "Oh, right, really? Okay." So the danger of telling people this is the best possibility can easily get misconstrued as...
Well, at least they were nice enough to let you know what you were up to that day. I mean...
Well, at first I was a bit sort of concerned about it, and then I stood on my doorstep with a cup of coffee and I thought, hang on, I'm not on my way back down to Dorset. I don't think it's ultimately was catfish. Therefore, what am I worried about? Just defend my truth and let everybody else figure out what they want. And it's, to me, it's up there as a front runner, as an explanation. I do despair in some of these chat rooms when I read the sort of militant view of it's not a catfish, it's not a sturgeon, it's a elasmosaur, it's a plesiosaur, it must be, and I think if you strip that if you strip that back enough, it basically comes down to it must be because I want it to be, and that's not enough to make it a plesiosaur, I'm afraid.
You get onto I think with everything. I mean, I am a big fan of that theory, but because I deal with lots of different cryptids, one thing I encounter time and time again with the concept of what people think things are is belief. And you shouldn't believe in anything. It's not about believing. It's not a religion or a faith. It doesn't require belief. It requires evidence. So it's strange.
It makes no difference whatsoever to the final outcome, whatever anybody believes.
Exactly.
It will be what it will be.
Yeah. But that's why some people get so angry about it being questioned or challenged, I think, because you identify in them a belief. And when you challenge a belief, you challenge the core. So that's an issue for those people. They don't realize what of their core being, this belief. And I think that's a lot to do with, in Bigfooting at least, that's a lot to do with, the absence of religion these days. People project that sort of need for a belief onto something else. Oh, absolutely. I think it's a paranormal creature. I think I went to first talk I ever gave actually was at Probe in Lymont, near Blackpool anyway, and it was a UFO conference, but I was talking about cryptids. And afterwards, I got the usual, they're paranormal, interdimensional travelers from another universe. And I said, okay, that's fair enough, but why would a paranormal interdimensional traveler or a ghost of some sort of dinosaur from the past be coming here to eat fish in our loch? It doesn't make any sense. The behavior doesn't follow, really. It doesn't follow the behavior of what you would assume a paranormal creature to be, but it does seem to have a lot of animal-like characteristics, so I'm going to sort of follow that route for a little while.
And I suppose that's where Occam's razor comes into the whole thing, that, there are there's only one person I know who believes that there's a spaceship on the bottom of the loch.
Yeah.
But he's pretty militant about his argument that it's there, and he's absolutely no evidence for it. But he's convinced that's the explanation. Now, I always say about religion that my guess as to the explanation of everything that's gone on in the history of mankind is as good as the Pope's guess.
Yeah.
Because he's not actually privy to any superior intelligence that said this is the explanation. And nobody is with this mystery. We all have the same pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to look at. We can all draw our own conclusion. And I find that the ones that draw the conclusion that there's nothing in here are the ones that have looked at the least number of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So it's easy then to say, wasting your time. Yeah.
And you find that they're the individuals that tend to be most disparaging, essentially, because when you can't dismiss something by the evidence and the anecdotal evidence of its being, you have to discredit.
Can't and belittle and
Just another quick question before we sort of wrap up. Now, some people have questions about why doesn't this creature come up to breathe very often? What could it be? Why don't we see it coming out to breathe very often? And Scott Mardis, the Lake Champlain researcher, friend of mine, he had a theory, admittedly not his own, that it could be similar to some turtles that you find that have cloacal bursae that allow them to convert oxygen from water and stay under. I think the Hawkesbury River turtle, is it 3 or 4 days it can stay down, and just it has this sort of hybrid system, oxygen conversion. What do you think about a theory like that?
I'm happy with whatever the explanation turns out to be. We don't know enough about it. But when people say, why, if it breathes air, why don't we see it more often on the surface? I always fall back on the knowledge that every few years we'll get a seal. A seal will come up River Ness following the salmon, and it will get into Loch Ness. It carries on following the salmon, and it gets disorientated. It can't find, or it doesn't want to find that exit back out down to the sea. And so it can remain in here for a month or 6 weeks or more. And I see it. I've seen one right in the corner of Dawes Bay out here. I've seen one. Guys that work on the fish farm, they'll spot it because the seal's going to be inquisitive about a fish farm.
Yeah.
And the guys like Ronald and the rest of them that operate the boat at Fort Augustus, they'll get onto me and say, "Oh, just spotted a seal by Cherry Island," or you know. So those people are the people that spot it. But if this happens during the summer, I can sit here the whole time I know there's a seal in here, and not one single tourist has ever come to me and said, "See your mystery of the Loch Ness monster? It's solved. Look, there it is. It's a seal." And yet we know a seal's in here. We know it breathes air. We know it comes to the surface quite a lot.
Yeah.
Nobody spots it. No member of the public has ever come to me and said, "I've just taken a photograph of a seal."
Very interesting. It's very interesting.
Although people say, "Well, there's so many people on the side of Loch Ness all the time with cameras. How come it's not seen more often?" Well, when we've got an animal like a seal in here, they don't see that. So what chance?
Also, a lot of the loch isn't visible from.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's no vantage point. I think that's a good idea. Perhaps a creature with very good hearing that just pops its head up when there's nobody about.
Yeah. Also, a characteristic that I've been aware of for a very long time. A good friend of mine back in the 90s used to float about on here with a catamaran, Doug McFarlane. He used to do a lot of sonar work privately. He never went public stuff. And he showed me chart after chart of contacts that he'd made. And what he figured out, because he lives down near Largs on the west coast of Scotland, he goes out in a little rib even to this day, following minke whales or all sorts of things down there. And the creatures that he picks up in the sonar beam here always had this characteristic of diving away from the sonar beam. So he spent a lot of time floating about with the machine turned off and then pinging it on, seeing what was about and turning it off again. And he got a lot of interesting contact, but they were always shooting away out of the beam. Now, it's possible that whatever's in here doesn't like sonar. There's plenty of animals that are repelled by sonar. That could be what's going on here, why we don't get it very often with sonar.
But if they had some form of sonar and a loch is dark and sort of unmanageable, I think, for any creature relying upon its eyes, as a Loch Ness would be, I think sonar would be a prerequisite. Absolutely.
Quite an intimidating neighbour in the body of water, really, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, thank you so much for coming. I think we'll leave it there, but it's a pleasure. You know, it's a real pleasure to pick your brains and find out about your journey. And where can people who want to get in touch with you, where can they find you if they have a sighting? Where can they support you? I know that you have products and things as well. How can they support the journey?
There's two places, really. There's my website, which is nessiehunter.co.uk, and that's got all my photographs that I take of. I've got it would be potentially the world's most boring photo gallery because all the photographs are taken from Dawes Beach looking straight down Loch Ness, but in all seasons, so there's some information on there. And I've got a Facebook group called Steve Feltham's Nessie Hunter Interactive Collective, where I think there's much more sort of live debate going on in there. So that's probably the Facebook page is probably the more active to the website. But both of those, you find me.
Fantastic. Steve Feltham, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.
Take care.